Auntie M, I don't think we're in Pollville anymore. This time on Poll Hub, our very own Twitter storm involving the Marist Poll, 538 forecaster Nate Silver, and an arguably misleading headline. And Donald Trump has been bashing the media, other than a handful of conservative outlets that regularly praise him, for the last 2 years. In light of the massacre at the Capital Gazette newsroom in Annapolis, we're looking at how Americans' views of the media have changed, at least among some groups. Also, one more look at the huge upset win by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. A deeper dive into that election reveals a different story than the one popularized by the pundits. Hey, and we're turning 50, or 1. We'll explain. Let's get started. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion. And
I'm Mary Griffith, Media Director for the Marist College Poll and the Executive Producer of Poll Hub.
On our last episode, Mary was on, and you and we were talking, and you said, well, next week I will be back on the other side of the mic. But here you are. You were so good, we wanted to have you back.
Actually, Barbara was called away today, so I'm sitting in once again for Barb, and we wish she were here with us today. But we had a very busy week here
indeed.
At the Marist Poll. Last week, Lee and I took the show on the road, so to speak, and we headed down to Washington, D.C. for a media appearance that Lee was invited to do on the Hill.tv's brand new show, What America's Thinking.
And I think I'm going to be a recurring guest on that, pollster guest. I'm not sure.
Well, we'll see.
I think it went pretty
week.
well, but we'll see. Tell the story.
That's the plan. So Lee was discussing, kind of looking back at 2016, something that Lee's done in the past, what mistakes were made, what can we learn, where do pollsters go from here? And it created quite a buzz on social media. So Lee, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, well, as you said in there, I didn't really say anything I haven't been saying since the morning after the 2016 election when Donald Trump was elected. So the fact that it created a little Twitter storm was kind of surprising, but it may have stemmed somewhat from the article. Anyway, here's what happened. So we're talking about the difference between the pollsters and how they did in 2016 and the forecasters, the Nate Silvers, the YouGovs, the Huffington Posts, and the like. And I was making the point I've made over and over again that the polls actually did not have, contrary to popular wisdom, a bad night in 2016. The national polls were pretty much spot on, and what state polls that were done, with maybe one or two exceptions, close to the election, didn't have a problem either. So it wasn't a bad polling year. And interestingly, Nate Silver also shares that view. So I was kind of pleased that in going back to some of his stuff, that was the case also, but you were going to jump in.
And it wasn't the only thing you talked about as well. I mean, you brought up at the beginning of this discussion that we need to not focus on the narrative in 2018, that in 2016, there was a lot of discussion. People thought, the pundits, the analysts thought that the narrative was baked in, and that wasn't the case.
Yes.
So the discussion about aggregators vis-a-vis pollsters was really a secondary point in this discussion.
So why did Twitter blow up? I'm missing something.
Well, because it sort of looked like I had sort of intimated that first of all, it was written initially that I'd said the Marist poll said there was a 2% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and everybody sort of then the thread went, well, what, he had a 98% chance that Trump was going to win? That's ridiculous. What we had said and what we released was that we had a 2% margin for Hillary Clinton in the national poll. That, I must say, the Hill article has corrected since. So although there was an initial reaction to that wasn't part of it.
That's not what
not
blew
a big
this
deal.
thing up.
The headline talked about how I was really, in the face of Nate Silver. I really went after 538. He's the biggest fish in the forecasting game, and I did include him in it. I also talked about how he had the lowest probability of all the forecasters that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And he warned people that, there's a chance this thing could go Trump's way. And he also said afterwards that the pollsters who were getting blamed for the misperception that Clinton was a shoo-in, really were not at fault.
So people tweeted after this Hill headline, people tweeted at him and at us, basically both blowing both of us up.
That's right.
Saying the Marist poll, fake polls, you don't know what you're talking about. And Nate Silver, fake. And then Nate having apparently not read anything other than the headline,
also jumped on that and
yeah.
said basically, the Marist poll, wasn't on target, and it was. It's okay. All water under the bridge. The thing we were trying to do is enlighten, point out that, as Mary said, don't get stuck in a narrative. Hillary wins, and she doesn't. Right now, the narrative is blue wave, blue wave, blue wave. Well, who knows? We'll see. That's still a little too early to get that. And also, I think one of the things we learned coming out of 2016 is that we really have to find a better way to communicate uncertainty. Statistics is not easy. People either assume that polls are really precise and scientific, or they're fake. And neither's true. They're based on science, but there's an art side to them. So that's why you see different results based on different pollsters using different methodologies, something we've been trying to emphasize in our weekly discussions. So anyway, some people were worried we're starting a civil war between the forecasters and the pollsters. We don't want to do that. We have no intentions of that. We're trying very hard to provide clarity to what was clearly a misunderstanding in 2016, and that maybe going forward in 2018 will be a little more enlightened.
And we do want to work with the aggregators as well to get that point across.
Yeah.
We, in fact, invited Nate Silver on this podcast today to discuss this with us. We haven't heard back from Nate, possibly because it's the holiday week. He could be off doing something fun. That invitation still stands. Nate, we'd love to have you on. Come on. We want to help inform the public about polling and about forecasting.
And it's interesting that we're still talking about 2016 in the middle of the election year of 2018. And I think that's partly because nobody's still put to bed the notion somehow that all the polls were wrong. And I think, and as a journalist for many years, I really think that the fault of almost all of this can be laid at the feet of journalists. And kind of non-journalist people who are in the media, and there's a lot of that. I mean, let's not confuse a journalist with the talking heads that we see on cable TV. Many of them are not journalists. None of prime time. Prime time is filled with non-journalists, right? And this came out of the fact that a tweet and a headline, which is by necessity an abbreviation of the story, was slightly misleading. One part was wrong, but then another one was slightly misleading, and people don't even bother, especially on Twitter. You don't even bother to click through anymore. It's like, well, if you can't say it in 140 characters, then I don't need to know it.
And there was no good visual, so you had to actually read this.
But this is a great case and a great example of what you and Barbara and all of us have been saying over and over, which is, stop just believing the first thing you read or just assuming that the first thing you read or that little bit that you read is the whole story. Take the extra minute to actually open up the thing or to watch the clip where you said exactly that Nate Silver did the best job of any of the forecasters in saying that she had a 66% chance of winning. Well, if you've ever been to Vegas, 66% chance doesn't mean you're going to win.
No. In fact, I've lost many times with a higher probability of winning than that. I probably would say one additional thing is, and very often we're talking about how the media translates polls to the public, and obviously we're concerned about that. We're concerned about how pollsters translate polls to the media, but I think there's also a collection of really savvy, insightful journalists, political journalists who we've had on this program and this podcast, and we'll have others, but the people like the Mark Murrays and the Amy Walters and the Ron Brownsteins and the Charlie Cooks of the world. These are people who are really, really not going to get put in a different, touted in the wrong direction by any poll results. I mean, I think they're very, very good in communicating, and there are others too. I don't want to get into the naming names, but I think so. So lessons learned. Mary, you were in the room where it happened.
I was in the room where it happened.
So everything okay now?
Everything is perfectly fine.
I'll go back on, try again?
Absolutely.
Okay, no doubt about it. I enjoyed it a lot.
Okay, so last week there was another mass shooting, this time in Annapolis, Maryland, at the Capital Gazette. And the shooting really brought into light criticism of President Donald Trump's comments about the media being the enemy of the American people. And so we just wanted to take a moment here during this podcast to take a look at Americans' views about the press and kind of where we stand.
Yeah, there's been a lot of polling about this over a long period of time. In fact, the pollingreport.com kind of collected a lot of this and did some of the legwork here that we're going to talk about. The idea that the media is the enemy of the people, I have to say, as a journalist, is astonishing in a democracy in which the First Amendment, not the Second, Third, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, the First Amendment is about the freedom of the press. And all of the founding fathers, you can find quotes about how important it is that there be a free press, a free media, and they didn't call it media in those days. And so some of these numbers are, I think, reassuring, and some of them are deeply troubling to me.
And different polling organizations have been doing things because obviously the media has become a headline in and of itself in this current administration, but it has been for a while. And we should preface this by all saying that a lot of our institutions in society are under scrutiny right now. So,
but it's
media,
different to say those questions about institutions are, do you have faith in an institution?
Yeah.
And sure, all of them fall off, and there's not a lot of faith in the media. I get that, but enemy of the people is really a different level.
Yeah.
And that's the question that the Quinnipiac poll asked.
Yep. And I think as I'm looking at some of these numbers, most people, almost 2/3 of registered voters nationally, think that the news media is an important part of the democracy, which I'm sort of glad to see as the political scientist. But 23% feel that it is the enemy of the people.
That's 1 in every 4. If you walk down the street, 1 in every 4 people is going to say, "Yep, media, enemy of the people."
And similarly, on 60 Minutes and Vanity Poll, they did a survey. And that also showed, in this case, that about 3/4 of Americans feel the press is a necessary check on political power. So that's the Fourth Estate argument that, and I think, I must say, in a time where we have the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court all of a similar political leaning, the press by definition is almost on the other side, even if they were just reporting stuff straight down the middle, because everything else is really tipping the other way. So in a sense, I think that only calls more attention to this, and that does invite criticism by those who are, in office.
We are going to take a look at some numbers pertaining to Americans' views of the press itself. But, a majority of registered voters nationally do worry that President Trump will limit freedom of the press. According to a 2017 Q poll, Quinnipiac University poll, 57% of voters are very concerned or somewhat concerned that this will occur. And, we did some polling on this as well. According to our 2017 NPR PBS NewsHour survey, 24% of voters nationally say that we've gone too far in restricting the freedom of the press. 24% say that 24% say that we have not gone too far in restricting the freedom of the press. Same proportion, 24%, say that we have gone too far in expanding it. But nearly half, 48%, say that things are okay the way that they are. One thing that we saw in our polling that we've also seen in the Quinnipiac polls as well is that there is a sharp divide in terms of political party on many of these questions.
Yeah, and then it also comes down to, again, as in polling, what you get is based on what you ask. So when people have done polls that they've asked some very, very specific things, well, that's where the criticism numbers bubble up. So when Q poll asked about whether the news media is honest, a majority say no. When CBS asks whether they're fully accurate, or they cover the news fully, accurately, and fairly, again, a number that's gone up from 36 to 50 say not so much, or no confidence at all included in that. Also, Pew Research. These are all reputable groups. The media's often, news organizations are often inaccurate. Fortunately, they also do think, getting back to some of the numbers that we've been citing, that news organizations and the media are very important to protect democracy, that the news media cares about doing the job they do, and that a majority thinks overwhelmingly that they are professional in what they do. So again, it's complicated. On the one hand, we like them. On the other hand, we're not so comfortable with some of these issues in terms of trust and honesty, but we think that the democracy really needs us.
And I just wanted to pose a question to Jay. As a journalist, being out in the field, you were out in the field for many years. What's your take on kind of where we are, the tone, the tenor, in terms of the way that the media is being portrayed vis-a-vis your experiences?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that there are always groups in society that feel that the media don't treat them well or fairly, and that used to be, you can go way back, but let's say in the last 30 or 40 years, that used to be people who were less possessed, had less possession in society. In other words, they were either poorer or they had less education or they were not white, for instance. So when I would go out to cover stories in boroughs in New York City or neighborhoods in New York City that were much poorer or much less well reflected in the media, they didn't really feel like they had a stake in what was going on. While they liked seeing the camera out there and all that, you would often hear criticism about how come you never cover X, Y, and Z? How come you never talk about X, Y, and Z? You're only out here to cover a murder or whatever that is. It's always just about how bad this is. And so, in reflection, that is a criticism of the media, and probably a fair criticism of the media. But I never heard fake news. I never heard people that, were upset with you because you were doing your job. They were upset because of the way you were doing your job. And that seems to be the significant shift here, is that this is kind of more like what you would see in maybe some Eastern European states or some countries where the media is not considered, or the press is not considered, something that's part of the founding documents of the country. They're not, mentioned in the constitution of that country, and therefore they're kind of easily marginalized as the other. And that's kind of what's happened. That's what's happening. Again, it seems to be a minority of people that feel that, but they're different than the group of people who were upset with the media, at least when I was on the streets and carrying the cameras and talking to people. It was a different group of people, and they were upset for different reasons.
And things have gotten more intense now.
About what you were doing. It was about how you were covering.
Okay, and I wanted to indicate just one more point on this topic, because one of the things we do at the Marist Poll is clearly we work closely with news media partners. They're wonderful. We love it. They're on top of the issues. They understand polls. I mean, it's a delight to work with those folks, and I even tell them that to their face. I will compliment people directly to their face, But I think also a lot of the people you're talking about, Jay, are the people who say the media, them, they. Yeah. It's kind of abstract. It's the bad guys, not necessarily have contact with them. One of the things I love about what we do at Marist is we bring these same journalists into the classroom. And one of the goals of that is to humanize the process, so that you've been in class, you've spent a seminar with a couple, 2, 3, 4, 5 journalists, and get to kick it back and forth and see how they approach things, see how they think things, and think things through. And I think hopefully, as a result of that, at least those students come around saying, well, it's not them. Them is really this person or that person. And it's kind of interesting. I've never seen a real journalist fail in front of students trying to explain this from a person's standpoint.
And now we bring them onto the podcast too. We've been doing that, and I think that's great for the audience as well to hear, especially in with regards to polling. So it's a specific thing. It's not just we're just going to talk to somebody. We're talking about a specific part of how they do their job, and I think that's actually super helpful in helping people understand that professional people are doing a professional job, and they're not bringing baggage into it, and they're not tilting it, and it's not fake news, and it's not none of that. I think it's
and I'm more than happy to talk about what a great job we do at Marist, and I'm happy to pat my shoulder, which I'm doing right now.
And last week we talked about the upset of Joe Crowley, congressman from Queens, Democratic boss, who more importantly, or at least more important nationally, was arguably kind of next in line to be Speaker of the House, because he's younger than the current Speaker, and there's been some talk that maybe the Democrats needed some new blood. That being said, he was blown out of the water in an election out of the blue. Nobody saw this coming, by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, if she wins the election, will be the youngest sitting House member of Congress. And she has caused a lot of media excitement. She's been on lots of shows and things like that. In particular, she was on the Stephen Colbert show. And take a listen to this.
I obviously, you're a very capable, intelligent person. Why do you think you were able to swing 51 points in 3 weeks and unseat this man who'd been there for 20 years?
Well, I think the first thing to kind of mention is that I don't think polling is always right.
We learned that in 2016. We learned that in 2016,
polling, here's the big thing. Polling, people try to identify who is the most likely person to turn out. And what we did is that we changed who turns out. And that changes the whole electorate.
And there's some really interesting insights there. Now, obviously, these are winners' words, and winners always like to say there was great enthusiasm, change the deck. But there's something to be said
right
for that.
about it, yeah.
And the polls, one poll was done by Siena, and why there was such a big surprise is they had Crowley winning by 10, and she obviously won and by 15. So that's a 25-point swing from the polls to that. Talking about changing perceptions in reality. So that's part of the surprise. I think she was surprised also. There was some
there's a picture of look up on her face. When she looks up the monitor for the first time and
wow, I won. But I think, so what do we take from this in the discussion that she's making from a polling standpoint? There's a lot of stuff we learned not only this past week with that, but in 2016, there's some registered voter-based samples that people are using based on people who have voted in past elections. This is a part of an effort to make it a little bit easier and less costly to poll. Patrick Murray at Monmouth has done a lot of research on what happened with those voter-based samples and found they came somewhat lacking in terms of helping get a good measure of who you're actually interviewing. So the whole thing is you want to get the right chemistry, and if you don't, then you can be surprised. So sometimes they undercount cells. Why? Because some of the people... Cell phones. And that people who... in your sample, do you have the right proportion of people who use cell phones? And you might undercount it because some of the folks moving in, some of the folks registering, like in the case of this congressional primary, they may be young, they may be people of color, tend to be more cell phone users. And so you might, if you're using voter-based samples and you're using past vote as a criteria in your models, then those folks are going to get missed, and that's where the surprise comes.
Isn't that her point? Was
Absolutely.
That if they used who voted in 2016 or 2014, her point is, we just went and got all those people. Most turnout in a primary, in an off-year primary is going to be 6, 7, 8%, right? Yeah. So you got 92% of the electorate out there to go find.
And so you got an odd thing, and you miss the energy. In other words, and what she's alluding to in political terms is she had the energy, and she had the new folks, and that people were engaged. And this model, if you do it this way, you run the risk of, you do some, I might say, at some peril, because you might be missing the folks who are coming into the electorate who you're not going to capture. Now, the question is, can you do this? And the answer is yes, you can. You can do it better by using what we hopefully do, the gold standard, a probability-based sample, where we include everybody. We don't go fishing for certain groups. We let everybody into the...
And when you say fishing for certain groups, what you're saying is you don't start with a registered voter sample.
No. We're trying with...
You're calling everybody.
Throwing the net out as wide as possible and interview people in the entirety of the instrument. So if you say, I'm talking to you, Jay, and you say, my chance of voting is poor... Well, you still might vote. Your probability of voting is less than if you said excellent. So do I include you and continue? And the answer is when we do it, yes. Some people use a cutoff model. I don't believe Siena did, but others do. And that is, if you said poor, you're gone, and you don't make it. Well, we believe that sometimes people who say they don't have a lot chance of voting, high chance, do vote. And people who say they have a high chance sometimes don't vote. We might give different weights to those groups. But we don't want to pitch people because sometimes they get reached by a campaign and they see the light in the last week and then they're part of the pool. So I think this is all a very, very good lesson in humble pie that you want to be careful how you draw the samples because you may be running a risk of missing a really critical group in this. And I think also there was a lot of talk about demographic changes, and I think there was some confusion over what really went on in this race in terms of the data.
That's right. Well, the narrative is focused a ton on energy, and it's also focused a lot on demography and the demographics. But it's interesting in that Stephen Romalewski, he's the director of the mapping service at this CUNY Center for Urban Research, and he really took a look at not just demography, but that there's something else that was going on in this race here. And he brings up the concept of drop-off voters. So, Lee, why don't you weigh in here? Who are drop-off voters, and how did they come into play?
Well, these are folks who I believe what he was alluding to were people who are typically not going to get into the mix, but now get engaged, and you then want to bring them into your models. And I think that that's very, very important, as we've alluded to.
But also that Ocasio-Cortez, she was expected to do really well in the Bronx, where there's a Latino population, but surprisingly to a lot of people, she did really well in portions of Queens.
Which is where Joe Crowley's from.
Yes.
Exactly, and he was, I believe, called the King of Queens.
Yes, he was.
For quite some time. And she actually did better in parts of Astoria and Sunnyside, I believe, where there's more of a mixed population. And Jay, I know you have some insight into that.
And Crowley beat her in a heavily Latino neighborhood in Queens. So
what's going on?
I think it was in the Bronx.
No, there's a neighborhood in Queens.
You're right.
What they did was they looked down at the precinct level. And in New York City, voting precincts are quite small and quite compact. They're not small by the number of people, but they're quite compact. And they don't tend to spread across neighborhoods, and they do tend to be somewhat contained in terms of their demography, as we've been talking about. But if you're familiar with New York City has been gentrifying, arguably for its entire existence, but it's really been gentrifying since the real estate crash in the late 80s. There has been a kind of a nonstop gentrification in which Manhattan, especially anything below, say, now 125th Street, is really expensive and really totally gentrified and out of reach of many people. And that includes a lot of young people. So young people, no matter what their color, young people, especially better educated young people who come to New York because there's tons of jobs for those people, Google and all these they have all these jobs, all these tech jobs and everything else. They can't live in Manhattan. And so they've moved to Williamsburg in Brooklyn. That's right across the river. Well, you can't live there anymore because that's too expensive. And they move further and further out. And one of the primary places of the last 5 or 6 years of this kind of influx of younger, better educated voters of all colors, this isn't a white thing, has been in the South Bronx and then in Queens, out along the 7 train and out along the IND lines. Boy, I just did myself calling that the IND. Anyway.
We won't tell anyone, don't worry about it.
In Woodside,
I know
Forest
what you meant.
Hills, in Astoria, these neighborhoods, which have always, have for a long time kind of resisted that gentrification, that has stopped. That has started. The gentrification has started. And that's what this research, when they looked at it precinct by precinct, the areas that had gentrified the most had the highest increase in turnout. And while they can't yet tell you what the demography is of that, there's the supposition that if you can get to the demography of who actually turned out to vote in those districts, it's going to be the newer residents who have been moving in.
Yeah, so there's lots of lessons to be learned in this. And I do think this is, after all, a learning process. And I think from the media standpoint, one of the lessons has to be, let the dust settle a little bit. Everybody was yelling, this is just a demographic change, and that's how, she won based on...
Or they were yelling that this is the proof that the Democratic Party is leaning so far left that it might as well just, hire Che Guevara to be its leader.
Yes, the Nancy Pelosi sort of argument. She made a comment to that. And then from a polling standpoint, there's a lesson to be learned, and that is, you got to let everybody into the sample, give everybody a chance. Don't rely strictly on past vote, because you do so at your great peril. I think also it's kind of entertaining from another standpoint, and this is my final brilliant insight on this topic, is that this is Archie Bunker's old district. So when All in the Family, for those of you who know what I'm talking about.
Now you're dating yourself.
Yes, this is from the same area in Queens that was the Archie Bunker All in the Family. So you
You sound like my mom.
Yes.
Is her name Edith too?
Elaine, close.
Now Archie.
So this is our 50th episode, and so it's we've been talking about this. We're not quite a year old yet, because that's in a couple of weeks. But 50 seems like a milestone. But is it a birthday? Is it an anniversary? What is this?
I don't know. We're still in diapers, I think, at 50. Mary,
We're still finding our way.
That's a better way of putting it, perhaps.
You've got kids, so after 50 weeks, we're still a baby, right?
Are we in the terrible twos yet?
That's coming. That's coming. Oh, that's such a good thing to look forward to, though, as we start fighting with each other more, perhaps.
This too shall pass.
Yeah,
no pun.
Let's hope. Anyway, happy birthday to us for whatever it's worth, or happy anniversary,
Yes,
and thank you to our entire audience that has been growing over this entire time for listening to us and for supporting us. We really appreciate it.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
And doing double time was Mary Griffith, not only the voice of the Marist Poll today, but also our executive producer.
And you're on the board of the Roper Center, Lee.
That's what I understand. And we just had our annual meeting, and they're doing very, very well, in part, I guess, because lots of people pay attention to their iPoll and use it as a resource, as do we, in finding out past questions and data and results over decades. Really, really helpful.
And as you all have been doing over the course of these 50 episodes, we have been getting questions from you, and we've been trying to answer them and be responsive to you. And we'd love, in our terrible twos, to take more questions. We'll try to be polite in answering them and not be teething or be angry with you. You can send them to pollhub@marist.edu. You can also check us out on social media, where we are everywhere. And that's probably the best way to send questions to us, because we get those all the time. We're always monitoring our Twitter and Facebook. At Marist Poll on Twitter, and Marist Poll Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. Lee?
And people are saying, some of the feedback I've gotten in these 50 episodes is that, they're trying to discern, what are we really like as people? Is this who we really are? Because they hear little things back and forth that we say. Sad news, folks. This is who we are. Okay, we're like this. The program ends. We're still like this.
Yeah, if the mics weren't here, this is what we do. Anyway.
Yeah.
That's kind of sad.
This is what we do, and take us for better or for worse in this case. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Jay. This was fun.
Happy 50th or first.